The morning sun had barely begun to rise over the rolling hills of Green Valley Farm when I was jolted awake by the frantic barking of my farm dog, Max. Max was a loyal German shepherd, always on high alert, but this morning his barks were different, more urgent, more desperate. I rubbed the sleep from my eyes, threw on my boots, and stumbled out onto the porch, still half asleep. "Max, what is it?" I called out, scanning the horizon for any signs of trouble. My heart raced as I followed his gaze toward the barn. There, crouched beside my prized cow, Daisy, was a woman I had never seen before. She was dressed in a wide-brimmed sun hat, yoga pants, and a tank top that looked like it had been bought from some overpriced boutique in the city. Her hands were firmly gripping Daisy's udders, milking her with a determination that was both impressive and infuriating. I froze for a moment, trying to process what I was seeing. This wasn't a neighbor or a lost traveler. This was a complete stranger, trespassing on my property and stealing milk from my cow, as if she had every right to be there. "Hey, what the hell do you think you're doing?" I shouted, my voice sharp and clear in the crisp morning air. The woman barely flinched. Instead, she turned her head slowly, a smug smile spreading across her face. "Oh, good morning. I was just helping out your cows. They looked like they needed milking." I blinked, unsure if I had heard her correctly. "They looked like they needed milking?" I repeated, my voice rising in disbelief. "Yes," she said, sighing as if I were some ignorant fool. "You're keeping them full of milk and not letting them live naturally." "I'm just making sure they aren't suffering." My brain short-circuited for a second. "Suffering? Ma'am, these are dairy cows. They are milked daily on a schedule with proper equipment. You can't just walk onto someone's farm and start." She cut me off, holding up a hand like I was an unruly child. "I don't need a lecture. I've done my research. Industrial farming methods are cruel. I'm simply milking these cows the way nature intended." Before I could even form a response, Daisy decided to speak for me. She lifted her back leg and delivered a kick so powerful it sent the milk pail flying straight into the woman's face. The force knocked her backward onto the hay-covered ground, and the white liquid splattered all over her expensive-looking yoga top. I had to bite my tongue to keep from laughing. Max, my ever-loyal farm dog, let out a satisfied huff as if to say, "Serves you right." The woman sat up, her face dripping with milk, her expression shifting from self-righteous to furious. "That's animal cruelty," she shrieked, wiping her face dramatically. "You've trained this cow to attack people." I took a deep, steadying breath. "No, ma'am. You just got kicked because you don't know what the hell you're doing." She stood up, fists clenched. "This is exactly what's wrong with farming today. You're hoarding milk like some greedy capitalist when the community could benefit from fresh, untainted dairy." I stared at her, completely at a loss. "Did you just accuse me of hoarding milk?" "Yes, and I will not stand for it," she declared, hands on her hips. "You're on my land," I reminded her. "You don't get to decide what happens with my cows." She scoffed. "Oh, please. As if you own them." "I literally do." She crossed her arms and smirked. "Well, I don't see your name on them." I opened my mouth, then closed it. I had dealt with a lot of nonsense in my life, broken fences, sick cattle, tractor engines that refused to start. But this was a new level of crazy. She wasn't done. "You can't just keep animals prisoner for your own profit," she ranted. "These cows deserve to be free, free to roam, free to be milked naturally by whoever needs their milk." I took a step closer, lowering my voice. "Lady, you broke onto my property, you stole from my animals, and now you're standing here trying to justify it. That's called trespassing and theft." She gasped, clutching her chest like I had insulted her very existence. "Theft?" she echoed, shaking her head dramatically. "Oh, honey, you can't steal something that belongs to nature." I had no words. None. My patience was already hanging by a thread, and it was about to snap. Then, as if this situation wasn't absurd enough, she whipped out her phone and started recording. "Everyone, look at this heartless farmer," she said into the camera. "Denying people the right to fresh, organic milk. Keeping these poor cows in captivity." I groaned and ran a hand down my face. "You're unbelievable. I'll have you know," she continued, "I have over 10,000 followers on my eco-lifestyle blog. If you don't start treating these animals ethically, I'll make sure the whole world knows what you're doing here." I let out a hollow laugh. You think I'm the bad guy in this situation? She nodded, absolutely serious. You are. And I'll be reporting you. I had officially had enough. Fine, I said, pulling my phone from my pocket. Then I'll be reporting you for trespassing. For the first time, she faltered. You wouldn't. I smirked. Watch me. With that, I dialed the local sheriff. Before I could even explain what was happening, he sighed and said, It's Karen, isn't it? I raised an eyebrow. You know her? Oh yeah, he said, sounding both tired and amused. She tried to liberate a neighbor's chickens last month. I laughed sharply. Well, today she's trying to liberate my cows. The sheriff let out a chuckle. I'll be right there. Karen's confidence wavered as she realized I wasn't bluffing. Now, she said, backing up slightly. There's no need to involve law enforcement. Oh, there absolutely is, I said. You broke onto my property and tried to milk my cows without permission. That's a crime. She rolled her eyes, muttering something about oppressive agricultural laws and corporate greed, but she stayed put, knowing she was cornered. Max, ever the enforcer, sat at my feet, tail wagging, enjoying every second of this. 10 minutes later, the sheriff pulled up in his cruiser. Karen put on the performance of a lifetime, dramatically claiming that she was just an innocent woman trying to protect the cows from a heartless, greedy farmer. The sheriff, arms crossed, gave her the same look a tired teacher gives a student caught cheating on a test. After about 2 minutes of her nonsense, he turned to me. You want to press charges? I thought about it. As much as she deserved a lesson, I had a feeling that dealing with Karen legally would be more headache than it was worth. Nah, I said, smirking. Just make sure she doesn't come back. The sheriff nodded and turned to Karen. You heard him. Get in the car. Karen gasped, utterly scandalized. This is oppression. The sheriff raised an eyebrow, and she wisely shut her mouth. As they drove away, I watched, shaking my head. I had a feeling this wasn't over. People like Karen never just let things go. And sure enough, I was right. This was only the beginning. The morning after the incident, I thought I could finally get back to my normal routine. The cows needed feeding, Max was eager for his morning rounds, and I had chores that wouldn't finish themselves. But the moment I stepped outside with my coffee, something felt off. There was an eerie silence, the kind that comes before a storm. Then my phone buzzed, and buzzed again. It kept vibrating in my pocket like it was about to explode. I pulled it out only to see a flood of notifications, messages from neighbors, customers, and even a few people I barely knew. My stomach twisted as I clicked on the first one. The headline smacked me in the face. Local farmer caught exploiting cows, denies milk to community in greedy power grab. Attached to the post was a grainy, distorted video of me yelling at Karen, taken from her phone. She had carefully edited out the parts where she was trespassing and stealing, leaving only the parts that made me look like a villain. The comments section was an absolute disaster. Strangers from across the internet were calling me everything from a corporate sellout to a heartless monster. One comment read, "How dare he keep all that milk for himself? What kind of selfish person hoards natural resources?" Another said, "These animals should be free. Milk is a human right." A third, even more ridiculous, declared, "This is why capitalism is evil. Let the cows go, oppressor." I took a deep breath, trying to process the absolute stupidity of what I was reading. Meanwhile, Max sat at my feet, looking up at me with what could only be described as pure judgment. He knew something ridiculous was happening. He always knew. Then came the real punch to the gut. A GoFundMe page had been set up in Karen's name. The title, Justice for Karen, help her fight against corporate dairy greed. The description was even worse. It painted her as a heroic activist who had bravely stood up to a cruel farmer and was now being unfairly targeted for trying to bring fresh milk to the people. At the bottom of the page was a donation count that made my blood pressure spike. Over $2,000 raised in less than a day. I let out a deep, exhausted sigh. This was spiraling out of control. Before I could even finish my coffee, a car pulled up in front of my farm. A whole line of cars, actually, at least 5. And then people started getting out, holding signs. My jaw clenched as I read them. Release the milk. Justice for dairy cows. Farmer greed. A full-fledged protest was assembling on my property. Karen was leading them, of course, now dressed in some sort of activist-themed outfit, a tie-dye shirt with a cow on it and a megaphone in hand. She had a wild, triumphant look in her eyes, like she had just led a rebellion. She lifted the megaphone and started shouting before I even had the chance to open my mouth. We are here today to take a stand against the unethical hoarding of milk. These cows do not belong to one man. They belong to the people, to the earth, to freedom. I stared at her, utterly baffled. You have got to be kidding me. The crowd cheered as if she had just given the speech of a lifetime. I noticed that half of them were city folks, probably people who had never even seen a real cow before. I spotted one guy wearing a leather jacket and sunglasses, holding a sign that said "Milk is theft," which was possibly the most confusing thing I had ever read. Karen continued, her voice rising with drama. This farmer has been exploiting these innocent animals for years, taking their milk, selling it for profit, and refusing to share with those in need. I had to physically hold myself back from laughing. Lady, I sell my milk at the market like every other farmer. That's literally how dairy farming works. But she wasn't listening. And what's worse, she went on. He called the police on me when all I was doing was offering these cows a better life. I was attacked, humiliated, drenched in stolen milk. One of the protesters gasped, as if this was the worst tragedy they had ever heard. You broke onto my property and stole my milk, I said as evenly as I could manage. That's not heroic. That's called trespassing and theft. Karen turned to the crowd. Do you hear that? He admits it. He thinks he owns the milk, as if he can claim nature's bounty as his own. Another cheer erupted from the protesters. One woman dramatically wiped her eyes, clearly moved by Karen's nonsense. I took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. All right, you've had your little speech. Now get off my land. Karen gasped, as if I had just cursed at her. You can't silence us. We have rights. We will stay here until justice is served. The crowd chanted in agreement. Some of them even started filming me, as if I was about to do something evil. I sighed and pulled out my phone. Fine. Then I'm calling the sheriff again. Karen's confidence wavered for just a second, but she quickly regained her footing. Go ahead, she said. The law can't stop the people. A few minutes later, Sheriff Dan pulled up in his cruiser. He got out, took one look at the scene in front of him, and rubbed his temples. Let me guess, he said, looking at me. Karen again? I nodded. Karen immediately ran up to him. Sheriff, thank goodness you're here. This man is hoarding milk, exploiting innocent animals, and silencing activists. Dan gave her a long, tired look. Ma'am, you are trespassing. Again. Karen threw up her hands. I am leading a peaceful protest against unethical dairy practices. Dan turned to me. Do you want me to arrest them? I considered it, but something told me that Karen wanted that. She wanted to be a martyr for her ridiculous cause. Nah, I said. Just get them off my property. Dan nodded and turned back to the crowd. All right, folks. You heard him. This is private land. If you don't leave now, I'll start making arrests. Karen whipped out her phone. I am recording this injustice. Dan sighed. Ma'am, you do that. But if you don't leave in 5 minutes, you're spending the night in jail. Karen's mouth opened and closed. She was clearly weighing her options. Then, finally, she scoffed, threw her megaphone into someone's hands, and turned on her heel. This isn't over, she snapped at me as they marched off, still chanting. I watched them go, shaking my head. This had started as a simple case of trespassing, but it had turned into a full-blown conspiracy against my farm. And somehow, I knew Karen wasn't done yet. Just when I thought the madness was finally over, things took an even crazier turn. A few days after Karen and her band of dairy revolutionaries were escorted off my farm, I started noticing strange things happening around the property. It started small. My feed bags had been slashed open overnight, spilling grain all over the barn floor. Then one of my fences had been mysteriously unlatched, and 3 of my cows had wandered halfway down the road before I managed to herd them back. At first, I chalked it up to bad luck, maybe some careless delivery guy or a strong wind. But then came the most ridiculous thing yet. I woke up one morning to find a handwritten sign hanging from my barn that read "Free the cows" in big, dramatic letters. It was tied up with a ridiculous amount of twine, as if whoever did it wanted to make sure it made a statement. Max was already sniffing around the barn, barking at the sign like it personally offended him. I pulled it down, shaking my head. I knew exactly who was behind this. Sure enough, later that afternoon, I spotted Karen lurking near the fence line, a suspiciously large tote bag slung over her shoulder. She was trying to look casual, but the moment she saw me, she jumped behind a bush as if that would somehow make her invisible. I had two choices. I could ignore her and let her play her ridiculous game, or I could confront her before she did something even stupider. Since experience had taught me that ignoring her only made things worse, I sighed and started walking toward the fence. The moment I got close, she popped up from behind the bush like some kind of cartoon villain and pointed at me. "You," she hissed. "How dare you continue this oppression?" I pinched the bridge of my nose. "Karen, why are you sneaking around my farm?" She straightened up, clutching the strap of her tote bag dramatically. "I am here on a mission of mercy. Your cows have suffered enough under your cruel capitalist regime, and I refuse to stand by and let it continue." I looked past her, half expecting to see some kind of backup squad hiding in the bushes, but for once, she seemed to be alone. I crossed my arms. "Karen, are you trying to steal my cows?" Her mouth opened, then shut, then opened again. "Steal? Steal? I am rescuing them. They deserve to be free." I exhaled through my nose, trying to keep my patience. "Karen, these cows were born and raised here. They are dairy cows. They are well cared for, well fed, and milked on a proper schedule. What exactly do you think you're saving them from?" She threw her arms in the air. "From you. From this twisted system of agricultural greed. These cows should not be property. They should be living their lives naturally, in the wild." I stared at her, wondering if she actually believed what she was saying or if she was just too deep into her own nonsense to back down. "Karen," I said slowly, "if I let these cows live naturally in the wild, they would die within a week." Her eyes widened, like I had just spoken some blasphemous statement. "That's not true. Cows lived in the wild before humans enslaved them." I blinked at her. "Karen, cows have been domesticated for thousands of years. They don't have wild instincts. They don't know how to forage for food or protect themselves. They are not deer. If I let them loose in the woods, they wouldn't last 2 days." She scoffed. "That's just what Big Dairy wants you to think." I let out a tired groan and rubbed my temples. "There is no Big Dairy conspiracy, Karen." She pulled something out of her tote bag, holding it up like it was some kind of sacred artifact, a bottle of what looked like homemade oat milk. "You could stop this," she said dramatically. "You could turn your farm into a dairy-free sanctuary. There are alternatives, healthier alternatives. Have you ever even tried oat milk?" I stared at her, utterly done. "Karen, I don't need to try oat milk. I run a dairy farm." She stepped closer, as if she could somehow convince me with sheer willpower. "You could be part of the change, a leader in ethical farming. You don't have to harm these innocent creatures for profit." I glanced at Daisy, who was standing nearby, lazily chewing her cud, looking about as oppressed as a cow in 5-star accommodations. Max, ever the voice of reason, let out a sharp bark. Karen flinched. I sighed. "Karen, I'm going to tell you this one last time. Get off my property. If I catch you sneaking around here again, I will have you arrested for trespassing, theft, and harassment." She gasped, like I had just threatened to burn her oat milk factory to the ground. "You wouldn't." I gave her a flat look. "Oh, I absolutely would." For a second, she hesitated. Then, with the dramatic energy of a soap opera villain, she pointed a finger at me and declared, "This isn't over," before spinning on her heel and storming off toward her car. I shook my head, watching her go. But deep down, I knew she was right about one thing. This wasn't over. And sure enough, the next morning, the sheriff showed up at my door, holding a stack of legal papers. "She's suing you," he said, barely able to keep a straight face. I choked on my coffee. "For what?" He skimmed the papers, then sighed. "Let's see. Wrongful eviction from your property, psychological distress from aggressive cow retaliation, and unlawful withholding of community milk." I stared at him. "Unlawful withholding of milk? That's not even a thing." He shrugged. "Apparently, she thinks it is." I ran a hand down my face. "You've got to be kidding me." "Nope," he said, tucking the papers back into his folder. "But I wouldn't worry too much. The judge will probably laugh her out of the courtroom." I sighed, already exhausted at the thought of explaining to a judge why kicking someone off my farm wasn't wrongful eviction. A week later, the case was dismissed before it even made it to trial. Karen, furious at the corrupt legal system, posted a 10-minute rant video about me, calling me everything from a milk tyrant to a foot soldier for the dairy industrial complex. I printed out a screenshot of her most ridiculous accusation. This man is hoarding liquid gold and keeping the people thirsty, and framed it in my kitchen. Because if nothing else, at least I had a good story to tell. And as I stood in my barn, watching my cows happily chewing their cud, I realized something. Karen might come back, but I'd be ready for her. Karen's crusade against my farm didn't end with the lawsuit. If anything, it only fueled her determination. Over the next few weeks, she continued to rally her followers, spreading more misinformation about my farm and inciting even more protests. The local news picked up the story, and soon, my farm was the center of a national debate about animal rights, farming practices, and the ethics of dairy production. I tried to ignore the noise and focus on my work, but it was impossible. Every day, there was a new headline, a new accusation, a new group of protesters showing up at my gate. My farm, which had once been a peaceful haven, was now a battleground. But I wasn't going to let Karen win. I knew the truth about my farm, and I knew that I was doing right by my animals. So, I decided to fight back, not with anger or violence, but with transparency. I invited a group of local journalists to tour my farm, showing them the care and attention I gave to my cows. I explained the science behind dairy farming, the importance of proper milking schedules, and the measures I took to ensure my cows were healthy and happy. I even let them taste the milk, straight from the source. The articles that followed were a mixed bag. Some praised my efforts and debunked Karen's claims, while others continued to paint me as the villain. But it was a start. Slowly but surely, the tide began to turn. Karen, of course, wasn't happy. She accused me of staging the tour, of bribing the journalists, of brainwashing my cows. But her followers were starting to see through her lies. The donations to her GoFundMe slowed, and the protests grew smaller and less frequent. Then, one day, Karen showed up at my farm again. This time, not as a trespasser, but as a defeated woman. She stood at the gate, her head bowed, her once fiery spirit extinguished. "I was wrong," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I see that now. I let my passion blind me to the truth. I'm sorry." I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to gloat, to rub her nose in her defeat. But another part of me, the part that had been a farmer for as long as I could remember, felt a pang of sympathy. "Karen," I said, "you don't have to apologize to me. But you do owe it to yourself to learn from this. Passion is a powerful thing, but it has to be guided by facts, not fiction." She nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I just wanted to make a difference. And you can," I said. "But not like this. Not by tearing others down. If you really care about animals, about the environment, then educate yourself. Work with farmers, not against them. We're not the enemy." She looked at me, really looked at me, for the first time. And in that moment, I saw something I hadn't seen before: humility. "Thank you," she said. "I'll do better." And with that, she turned and walked away, leaving my farm and my life for good. The months that followed were quiet. The protests stopped, the headlines faded, and my farm returned to its peaceful state. But something had changed, not just in Karen, but in me. I realized that I had been too quick to dismiss her concerns, too quick to label her as crazy. Yes, her methods were misguided, but her heart was in the right place. And that was something I could respect. So, I decided to make a change of my own. I started hosting open farm days, inviting the community to come and see for themselves how a dairy farm operates. I partnered with local schools to teach kids about agriculture, about where their food comes from, and about the importance of sustainable farming practices. And slowly but surely, the narrative began to shift. People started to see me not as a greedy capitalist, but as a farmer who cared about his animals, about his land, and about his community. As for Karen, I heard through the grapevine that she had started a new blog this time, one focused on sustainable living and ethical farming. She even reached out to me once, asking for advice on how to start a small-scale dairy operation. I didn't hold a grudge. In fact, I was proud of her. She had taken her passion and channeled it into something positive, something real. And as I stood in my barn, watching the sunrise over the fields, I realized that sometimes the greatest battles lead to the greatest victories. Karen had come into my life like a storm, but in the end, she had left behind something beautiful, a new understanding, a new beginning. And for that, I was grateful. Thank you for taking the time to listen to today's story on Store of Good Stories. If this story touched your heart or made you think, don't forget to hit like and share the video to spread this positive message to more people. And if this is your first time here, make sure to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss any of the meaningful stories we share every week. Your support is the biggest motivation for Store of Good Stories to keep bringing heartfelt and valuable stories to you. See you in the next video.